Hi guys, Mr. Haupt here, and this is lesson 9C on the subject of writing introductions, topic sentences, and choosing evidence for our AP synthesis exam. So obviously this means we're getting closer and closer to this body of this particular type of writing. We've prepared for it. We've thought about the big picture of what this synthesis essay is all about. And now it's time to start getting into the nuts and bolts of the individual ingredients beyond, of course, just the thesis and preparation. So let's obviously start off here with talking about the introduction and delve into some stuff that's obviously going to be a little bit review because, again, we're not reinventing the wheel just because we've gone from rhetorical analysis to argumentation and argumentation to synthesis. But some of those things that we just want to make sure that we've got in the backs of our minds as we start to delve into synthesis. So, first and foremost, as if it wasn't anticipated already, we've got engage the reader's attention and organically walk them into the topic of your argument. So, yeah, I mean, whatever your hook is, whatever that appealing little thing that's going to make them want to get in reading and want to keep going through this and think, this person's got something unique and interesting to say, do it, okay? Ease us into where you're going with this issue. Because remember, and this sort of harkens back to what we've talked about in the past, that whole concept of the party. You're participating in a conversation in a party that started long before you got there. That's what synthesis is like. So it can be very daunting for a reader to sort of find their way into this synthesis essay because, as you will know, you're already going to have read 7 other or so sources on this particular topic before you write your own, which is going to incorporate some of those sources. So think about how overwhelming that could feel to the reader. So walk them into it, ease them into it, and make sure that you're engaging them in a way that makes them want them to keep reading, okay? Some things to think about in your introduction, questions that you might want to be answering and fodder for discourse that you could be putting in there. First off, why is this topic important? I mean, we've talked about that so many times at this juncture. As far as intros and conclusions are concerned, explaining to them why this is an important topic. Okay, assume that they don't have any personal investment in it. They thus far haven't cared one whit or iota about it. Well, now make them care. Why is this topic important? And one of the best ways to demonstrate that a topic is important is to talk about the consequences that the topic raises, okay? If they can see that this has real-world ramifications, consequences that might affect their lives, the lives of their children, other people's lives, their, local township, whatever the case may be, that's a good way to make sure that they understand, okay, well, this is pretty gosh darn important, so I should make sure that I'm dealing with this appropriately, okay? Of course, this means you're also going to need to ask, what do they already know? And again, this hopefully at this point in the game is just perfunctory, we'll say. It's a perfunctory step for you guys because you shouldn't be doing anything or analyzing anything without first considering that rhetorical situation. As you know, the rhetorical situation, it was literally, I think, the second lesson that we talked about in this course back in presumably September. So it's such a big deal and it covers so much of what we talk about. Well, that's what we're getting into with number 3 here. Who is my audience? What do they already know? Why should my audience care? Stuff of that sort, okay? Sort of identifying who they are and what they do know and don't know and need to know and should know and all of those kinds of things. So again, just sort of circling back to that rhetorical situation before you start to make the major decisions that you need to make to write the best essay that you possibly can, of course. Now this one, as it says, conclude your introduction with your thesis. So that's a piece of advice your textbook gives you. I know normally speaking, we generally think of the thesis as being a little bit earlier in the introduction than the end of the introduction. But again, like I said, this could be a very overwhelming kind of topic for your reader. So that whole walking them into the topic might be a necessary component of this and sort of naturally lend itself to the prospect of putting your thesis at the end of the introduction as opposed to the beginning. Okay, in short, there might be a lot of things we need to present and share with our reader before we can even get to the point of saying, okay, now here's my thesis, all right? But, long story short, just make sure that you've got a thesis in there, okay? Again, don't forget this is all about rhetoric, and rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and you need to have a thesis in that intro so that we know that you're persuading someone of something, okay? That brings us down to topic sentences. Obviously, those are never not important. Okay, they just continue to be important to guide us through what it is that we're doing, and that's exactly what this first bullet point says here. They should be indicating the focus of each paragraph. Again, you know that. This isn't new stuff at this point. It's really beating a dead horse, but they're that important that you don't want to neglect them. So just make sure that as you're getting into the body paragraphs of your synthesis essay, you're identifying the topic sentences. You might even want to, before you even start writing the body paragraphs themselves, outline this essay simply by making your thesis, making the topic sentence of each of your main body paragraphs, and so forth. And that way you have a better sense of what the structure is going to be, and then it's really just sort of filling in the gaps in the intro, in the body paragraphs, and then eventually writing that conclusion. That's just one way that you could think about writing this. Of course, there's no right or wrong way, and you do whatever works best for you and your audience in terms of the rhetorical situation, okay? Topic sentences do typically start the paragraph, state the author's claim, and provide context for future evidence. Again, that's old hat at this point. Remember, they're sort of the hinge that connects that line of reasoning between the thesis and the evidence. There's going to be that commentary that glues the evidence to the topic sentence and then thus back to the thesis. So you just want to make sure that you've got all of those things right there in that topic sentence ready to go so that when you do start plugging in the evidence, it's all valuable and worthwhile and effective, okay? That takes us then down to evidence. So obviously this is a big deal because remember, in this synthesis essay, you're pulling evidence from sources that the AP test has personally given you, okay? So remember, in that case, this means that you're probably choosing a minimum of 2. Hopefully it's more like 3. You're choosing the best ones that you possibly can, and those are going to be the fodder for your evidence that you're presenting in this synthesis essay, okay? So some things to think about as you're starting to pull out that evidence. Remember that if 2 sources say essentially the same thing, you probably don't need both. So the ultimate question is going to be, okay, so which one's stronger? And keep in mind what that means, stronger in this context. Stronger could go in 2 directions. Stronger might be, well, this one just says it better. It might be this one has better data. It might also be this one seems more credible. This seems like a source that people would be more likely to believe. It's more trustworthy. It's written by more of an authority, things of that sort. Okay, so if 2 sources are saying essentially the same thing, you're going to probably want to just pick one of them as opposed to both of them. And it comes down to, okay, which one is stronger, all right? I am personally saying, and I know that previously the textbook would have indicated you should be using at least 2 sources, and that's true. I think you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you don't go for at least 3. So I'm making my official declaration, and personally what I'm looking for when we're doing these synthesis essays in my classroom is I want you guys to have 3 sources. I don't think that's too much to ask, okay? It gives you a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more flexibility. I feel like you can get a wider range of information, better information. And now granted, I don't want you to shortchange any one of those, which is sort of the risk of including too many sources. But I don't think 3 runs that risk as much as using 4 or 5 or 6 or so on and so forth. So like it says here, trying to use more than 3 might lead you to an unnecessarily complicated essay at best, in the sense of it might be hard for us to follow, particularly since you only have 50 or so minutes to actually write it, and it's not going to be that long. So trying to get into all of those sources is going to make things a little too overwhelming for us, the reader. And remember, I said you're walking us into the topic from the get-go, so it might be something that we're already a little puzzled by. And then to start throwing in all those excess resources in this abbreviated time frame is just too much to handle, okay? At worst, trying to use more than 3 sources could create a pyramid of similar superficially treated points piled up on top of one another. To sort of put that into different language in that case, you're addressing all of these different sources too minimally, and you're just throwing them next to each other again and again and again and again and again, so that really you're not developing any coherent ideas. There's too much evidence, and it's too thinly utilized for it to actually build towards any meaningful notions. So that's why I think 3 is good. 2 if you're really crunched for time and you don't think you can handle any more. But I would say 3 should be your goal. Okay. So some things to note about that. 3 sources can show progress in your argument by demonstrating how ideas have changed over time or how they are vastly different from one another. So let me put that into perspective for you a little bit. Think about that. If you're showing two sources, 2 sources kind of might not necessarily show this concept of progress. It might show, especially if those 2 sources really agree with one another, that like, okay, here's an idea. All right. And especially if you're choosing sources to some extent that are going to agree with the point that you're taking, 2 sources agreeing on your point makes it look like it's a very sort of superficial argument, that there aren't lots of sides to that issue. But think about it in the way of now having 3 sources where 2 of them agree with your argument and one of them disagrees that you're using for counter arguments. Now we can see sort of the differences between the commentary, how the conversation, that great conversation in which you're participating, varies from person to person or from source to source. And it can also show, particularly if these sources are written at different periods of time, how the understanding and the notions of this particular topic have evolved over time. Okay, maybe you have one source from really far in the past, one from 10 years ago, and one from last year. That's a great kind of cross-section of sources to incorporate, and it's that flip side of the coin. Either you're showing how there are lots of different views by having 3 sources, or you're showing how it has changed over time by having 3 sources. In any event, 3 sources is really the good standard to try to strive for, okay? If you choose to argue a qualified position, 3 sources will give you, for instance, 2 authors who argue against something and one who is in favor of it in particular circumstances, supporting your qualified rejection of the claim. So that kind of reiterates something that I just mentioned to you a couple of moments ago about how you can have 2 sources that support your claim and one that kind of disagrees with it. But this sort of clarifies that a little bit and says, hey, if you're specifically having one of those qualifications, remember that would imply in this case that I agree something is true when blah, blah, blah happens. I agree something is false as long as such is the case. That's that qualification that you're applying to your thesis in that situation. So if you have 3 sources in that case, 2 of those sources can just agree with that, major opinion that you're sharing, but then that 3rd source can say, okay, but I also want to support that qualification that you're adding to that thesis. So that's another reason why 3 sources work particularly well for a good synthesis essay, all right? Of course, you want to be looking for the connections between the different sources. Where are they similar? That doesn't mean you're ignoring what is different about them, but you want to know what is similar about them as well, particularly as they might overlap in terms of your thesis in particular. So those are things to think about there. Make sure you strive to understand each text on its own terms, particularly those you initially disagree with. Almost like sort of taking them outside of the context of these 7 or so sources that you're looking at and pretending like the other 6 don't exist. Here's this source. Let's address it as though it's the only one on this particular topic. What are its merits? What are its disadvantages? How can that benefit me as I'm writing my synthesis essay? You'll find yourselves a lot more adaptable and finding a lot more interesting and relevant and helpful information, clever information, if you can sort of set aside the whole great big context of these body of sources and look at it on its own terms as a standalone text that is really almost starting the conversation as opposed to participating in this ongoing conversation, okay? Remember that each text you select must serve some function to support your own position. That goes without saying, I would hope, but remember, you're not choosing sources just for the sake of choosing sources. You're not choosing sources just because I told you you should have 3 sources. You're choosing sources because they help to argue your thesis, because they help to support your claims, whatever your claims may happen to be. So make sure you're asking yourself, as you go through each of these different sources, what would be the function of this? What would this help me to argue in my synthesis essay? And if you can't answer that question, well, either that's not the source for you, or maybe you don't need another source, okay? So things to keep in mind in that case, all right? A source should only be used when a claim needs support and when the evidence is relevant to the claim as well as the thesis you've written. hopefully that goes without saying, just like so much of what we're talking about in this case. Obviously, you've got a thesis. Everything is supposed to support that thesis. The claims that are in your topic sentences should all link back to that thesis. And obviously, all of the sources should link to the claims, which subsequently link to the thesis. So it's just making sure you've got this degree of relevance that is ongoing and it connects all of the lines of reasoning together throughout the course of your essay. So like I said, that's basically make everything relevant. That's what we're talking about in that case, okay? Remember that your argument can be weakened by relying too heavily on evidence. Say what? Quoting too many other sources distracts from the logic and strength of your own position. That is true. And it's one of the reasons why I've warned against quote dumping. Having quote after quote after quote after quote after quote after quote after quote, okay? We might get a sense that these sources have a strong opinion on this matter, but that doesn't mean we're going to get a sense that you have a strong opinion on this matter, and moreover, an informed strong opinion on this matter that you can articulate effectively. So don't think the more evidence automatically the better. That isn't what that necessarily means. That's why I'm not saying try to use all 7 sources in your synthesis essay. That's why I'm saying 3 is a good number to use, okay? Because too much evidence can work against you, not help you, all right? Remember that tenuous evidence can create gaps in the line of reasoning that weaken the entire argument. In short, don't try to force it. Don't try to force evidence in there that doesn't perfectly articulate your argument and that can't adequately be connected via the line of reasoning. Because it's going to end up creating a gap. We're going to see some disconnects in your argumentation, and as a consequence of that, it's going to mean that you're going to be far less effective at accomplishing your end goals, okay? Make sure that you're selecting evidence and sources based on those that your audience would view as most reliable and valid. Again, thinking about the rhetorical situation, who is your audience, but then also taking a step back and taking a look at the sources that you've been provided and saying, which actually are the best sources? Which are the sources that I would trust the most if I were the audience? Which are the sources that have the utmost ethos and credibility and are worth using in this context, okay? So that's a twofold plan in that case. A, asking what your audience would prefer in a resource, but also B, asking yourself which are the best resources among the 7 and the most worthy of use, okay? Keep in mind, just because we're in the synthesis section and not the argumentation section, doesn't mean that personal experiences and observations are completely outlawed, okay? They can still be there. They obviously aren't the sole means of evidence that you should be using like they were perhaps back during the argumentation essay, but they can be there and they can, as a consequence, really help to build your ethos. So keep that in the back of your mind. We're not neglecting ethos just because stuff is all coming from our sources. Ethos might be slightly less relevant than it was during the argumentation essay, but it's not irrelevant. And so if you can have some personal experiences or observations to help that ethos, then by all means do it, okay? And lastly, we have here for our evidence, make sure that you're balancing your use of objective research-based sources with anecdotal personal sources based on the audience and rhetorical situation. So again, this is still at the end of the day rhetoric. And if you think about everything we've talked about regarding rhetoric, we talked about the fact that there's a full range of tricks that you've got up your sleeve. And that means that you've got the 3 appeals, okay? You've got logos, pathos, and ethos. You've got those, I don't even know what the number was, 7, 8 different types of evidence at your disposal. And we've spent so much time during the course of the year outlining the fact that you should never just be relying on one type of anything. That doesn't change just because this is a quote-unquote research paper, because it's got sources. That still holds true. And you want to make sure that, yes, you've got these objective research-based facts, but if there are anecdotes, personal sources, and this goes both from your own personal experience or from the sources themselves, some things that are less objective and logos-based, by all means use them, okay? Because, again, the goal is rhetoric, the art of persuasion. And persuasion comes in lots of different flavors, and synthesis doesn't mean that we're going to ignore whole categories of it just because it's a slightly different type of writing. All right? So those are some key things that I wanted to communicate to you guys about evidence and topic sentences and introductions. as far as the synthesis essay is concerned. So now we're knee deep in the body of that essay itself. As always, if you happen to have any questions or concerns, please feel free to bring them to class the next time I see you. And I will be seeing you shortly, guys. Thank you very much for joining me.